Hi everybody. It's week 5. Let me turn that up a little bit. Okay, it's week 5, and I think my PowerPoint briefing said week 5 on the lecture last week, even though it was week 4. So I apologize for that in retrospect. Um, this week I'm going to talk about diversity in the workplace, just really short. I only have 12 slides in this presentation, so I promise this one's going to be short, as I want you to read the 3 readings I gave you. Um, Johnson and Borrego, Mastracci, and Herring. And then there's an additional one that's not on the syllabus, Colby and Ortman. The Colby and Ortman article is actually from the US Census, and you can kind of skim that, but it's an interesting article to just to have as a reference. And I will talk about each of these throughout this presentation. Okay, so this week you're reading chapter 4 in the Pines text, and the topic is diversity. Okay, so the real question is this: why diversity? Uh, I guess it's our good fortune or bad fortune, however you want to think about it, to live in a very interesting time in American history. Um, we're living in a really, really polarized time, and I think you all know that. That's not news to anyone. But because we're living in a polarized time, you often can read and hear uh, a lot of talk about diversity, and some people really openly stating that diversity nets us nothing. Um, my personal opinion, and I'm going to give my personal opinion, and that is by 2018, I don't understand how diversity can even be controversial. That is my personal opinion. But it remains controversial in many sectors. Last week in the discussion, we talked about race conscious admissions in higher education. Right now, one of the readings I gave you, Harvard University is being sued because the plaintiffs contend that Harvard University uh, and its race conscious admission program has either intentionally or unintentionally excluded Asian Americans from consideration um, of the type that the plaintiffs believe Asian Americans should have. So the point is that we talk about diversity a lot. But here's my answers to why diversity. One, very simply, is our population in the US is changing, and that's the purpose of giving you that Colby and Ortman article from the US Census. So really it behooves us to have workplaces that look like the population. So right now, today, around 62% of the population is white and 38% non-white. We could simplify that by saying it's about 60-40. The point is that the white population will decrease and the non-white population will increase through the year 2060 and beyond. So by 2060, about 48% of the population will be white, 52% of the population non-white. And if you look at that report, what you also will see is that the under 18 cohort of the non-white population will grow faster than the under 18 cohort of the white population, meaning that those percentages will skew even more. So just as a simple matter of fact, our population is changing in terms of its racial makeup. The second thing that Pines notes is that diversity can lead to greater productivity. And you can look at some of the studies that she cites there. That goes along with the Mastracci and Herring article, where they cite an article by Herring, I think from 2006, where Herring finds that diversity in the private sector actually leads to more profit. Lack of diversity actually prevents the inclusion of more than one point of view. So really, I think we could safely say that the workplace in the United States Um, Perhaps up to now, but it certainly up to the 1970s anyway was dominated by white males. And actually, in a lot of professions, the workplace is still really dominated by white males. So, again, my question in 2018, should diversity be controversial? So, this kind of takes us back to the previous week, um, week 4, where we talked about equal opportunity law. So, equal opportunity is very uh, law based. So, e equal opportunity and affirmative action are legal requirements, and they are designed to bring women and minorities into the workplace. Diversity management, however, includes management processes designed to create a more supportive environment. Um, and so, in managing diversities, employers have to understand that and then manage the organizational cultures. So, really, there's kind of these two conflicting goals, as Pines points out, when it comes to diversity management. Um, that is that, every organization has a culture, really, and so we have to have some expectation that employees are going to uh, accept and integrate somewhat into the organizational culture. However, the other goal, which is in conflict somewhat, is that we have to encourage employees and managers, I would say, to accept differences between people, recognizing, and that last bullet, recognizing that all of us in a workplace actually come from different places, right? So um, we come from different places, we come from different backgrounds, we come from different cultures in many respects, and that the practice of diversity actually is designed to not only accept those differences, but to leverage those differences into higher productivity. So let's talk about gender inequality first, and why we need gender diversity in the workplace. Um, so I just looked up some quick numbers that women still make less than men do in the general economy. So this is from the census. There's a link there that salaried women employees make about 82% of the salary of male employees in similar jobs. That's a 2016 number from the census. Well, actually, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics through the census. Um, Women continue to dominate in certain professions, such as teaching, nursing, and many clerical professions, but they are still underrepresented in a lot of professions, such as lawyers and physicians. So even though actually a lot of women are employed in healthcare, um, the bulk of them happen to be nurses, technicians, and um, other professions. Um, the majority of physicians are still men. Um, and so finally, this last bullet, and that is that recent revelations in the media over the last couple of years should convince us that women in the workplace are still continue to be subject to sexual harassment from men who men thought to be liberal or conservative. And I only throw that in there just once again to pay homage to our continuing political divisions. No one would accuse Harvey Weinstein of being a conservative, for example. No one would accuse Bill O'Reilly of being a liberal. My point is that um, this seems to be a cross-cutting kind of ill in the workplace. Um, I put in the Mastracci and Herring article. Actually, Sharon Mastracci visited UNO maybe about 3 years ago. She's a really interesting professor, has a lot of interesting research. Um, this article talks about why women seem to find themselves in the nonprofit sector versus the for-profit sector. So what they say is that by percentage, nonprofits employ a higher percentage of women within their organizations, and also within those organizations, there's more full-time women in those nonprofits then percentage-wise, then for-profits seem to be hiring. One of the things they talk about the various types of nonprofits in that survey that they use as their data. What I noted was that 38% of the employers in that survey are the hospital sector. That's a pretty high percentage. And so I would reason that a lot of the women in the nonprofit sector that are in this data could be nurses and technicians and others in healthcare. So that may or may not vary from other nonprofits. However, social service nonprofits also have a higher percentage of women. What was interesting to me were their three hypotheses, and the one they talk about that is supported from their measurement, and that is that transparent work practices seem to favor women working in nonprofit. In other words, what they seem to be pointing out is that transparent work practices in a workplace basically mitigate against what some people might call a good old boys network. In other words, how do people get promoted in their jobs in the typical workplace? Do they get promotion through a transparent process that encourages people to apply for promotion and compete with each other for promotion based on work successes and experiences? Or do people get promoted basically because they know someone, or they go golfing with someone, or they hang out with someone at the bar on Friday night? Those are some very real questions, I think, in workplaces that we shouldn't really trivialize. And as Mastracci and Herring are pointing out, that research needs to continue to be done in those areas, because that really is a contention that rings true with a lot of women, especially that they didn't feel they were part of the club, and so therefore weren't promoted at a rate commensurate with their male counterparts. So, related to gender diversity in the workforce, these four terms are noted by Pines, and I'm sure you've heard actually all four of these. The first one in particular, the classic case of the glass ceiling, where artificial barriers are created that block the advancement of women and minorities into management positions, right? And so we can actually see that in effect. The sticky floor situation, which I like the analogy there, that women and minorities are excellent in staff positions or as lower level management, but they're denied promotion. They're just kept at the floor level. The glass wall, what that really refers to is the ability to move laterally, perhaps from staff into first level supervisory positions, even though you can see the requirements of that job right next to you. You're not allowed, and you probably have the qualifications to do that job, but you can't get through that wall. And finally, this idea of the glass elevator, which is an interesting one because it actually refers to the phenomena of men in traditionally female occupations actually advancing faster than women. And I don't have data in front of me. It would be interesting to ask questions. Do, for example, men become school administrators faster than women if the man and the woman started out as K-12 teachers? So those are the kinds of questions that we need to ask. Okay, so I put this slide in here really just to remind everyone what the definition of sexual harassment is, because I stated it still goes on. We know it still goes on, but it's not as if we haven't had a definition of sexual harassment for quite a while. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has this definition that it was put together in 1989. Basically, we do know that sexual harassment, there's two forms at the bottom of the slide: a quid pro quo kind of sexual harassment where sexual demands are placed on an employee as a condition of employment, or the idea of a hostile environment where continued sexual harassment creates an environment where the individual or perhaps the group of individuals are unable to effectively do their jobs. Either way, it actually creates an unwelcome work environment that really ends up being counterproductive. This slide and the next slide talk about sexual orientation and transgendered individuals. This is really kind of a step in the evolutionary process towards full diversity in the workplace. It is just a fact that that the recognition of the rights of persons with different sexual orientations and persons who are transgendered has been something of a long struggle, and that struggle took place really in the wake of, I would say, the wake of the civil rights struggle for persons of color and the wake of women's rights struggles. And so in my estimation, at any rate, these all seem to be part of the same struggle to recognize that our workplace writ large, if we think of the United States as one large workplace, our workplace in a large sense is really better off with diversity. And the diversity of sexual orientation and diversity for transgender persons has come with a struggle, and a struggle that continues. So take a look at this slide. It relates to the Pines text as well as the next slide. And I think my point that I would just want to drive through on this particular lecture is just that our diverse workplace must continue to evolve and recognize, really, and this is the positive part of diversity, recognize that a workplace really is better off with diversity. And for some persons to feel afraid of diversity, well, okay, I personally, I think they need to change their minds. However, I think that the reality is that the workplace continues to change, and you as human resource managers need to understand that change continues. And that does lead me to this idea of cultural competency that Pines talks about, and the article that I gave you, Johnson and Borrego, talk about as well. So Pines defines cultural competency as this set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals that enables effective work in a cross-cultural situation. So cross-cultural situation, right? So we talked about some of this data. We talked about how demographically our nation is changing. So we can look at many of the cultures at work with each other in our society overall, in terms of racial characteristics, in terms of gender characteristics, also in terms of sexual orientation and gender orientation. There are many other aspects of cultural, cross-cultural workplace environment that we have to recognize. For example, not everyone was born in the United States. And so obviously the cultural place that they come from is also different. Not everyone came from the same place economically. And so there are vast cultural differences between people who were, for example, at a higher socioeconomic level than those of a lower socioeconomic level. But again, the pitch that Pines is making, and I think the pitch that I really agree with, is that our workplace is better off with diversity. So Johnson and Borrego have an interesting article, and what's interesting about that article to me is the methodology that they use. They interview primarily young people of different racial backgrounds, white, black, Asian, Hispanic, and they asked them for their perceptions of the other groups. And so the point they seem to be making is that a lot of people, most people, engage in stereotyping of the other. And so the issue for Johnson and Borrego becomes this: should we insist on assimilation in the workplace? That is, should everyone be forced or coerced into accepting the dominant culture of the workplace, or should we strive for a multicultural kind of environment? And again, the problem with assimilation is that it subconsciously or consciously privileges the dominant culture. So when we say, look, just accept the dominant culture, we could really be saying, look, just accept the white male culture. So that's really an issue that we have to come to terms with our eyes open. And that's what this slide talks about, that incumbent employees, perhaps meaning older people, might have either conscious or unconscious biases that keep them from accepting newer, different employees. However, we actually can address this through training and management, and actually face diversity head on. And I think that's the bottom line of this entire lecture, really. That is that diversity is something that I think from a strategic human resources management perspective, has to be addressed head on and not ignored or not assumed to be happening when it's not. It is actually uncomfortable for a lot of people to talk about diversity. And if you talk about diversity in a workplace, there will be people who are either uncomfortable, there will be people who are openly hostile to the idea of talking about diversity, but it's an issue that, left untalked about, perhaps isn't going to happen. So all that leads me to this week 1 summary. So here's what I want you to do on the week 1 summary. It's kind of a reflective piece. That I want you to reflect on how expected changes to our jobs economy and its resultant changes to the public and nonprofit sector will affect our progress towards equal opportunity and diversity in the various aspects of human resources management. Okay, so here's what I'm saying. We talked about how our jobs economy might be changing, going towards sort of a gig type economy. We talked about equal opportunity and treatment. We talked about diversity. So my question is, are the changes in the economy or in the changes in the workplace, are they going to continue to help us make gains in terms of diversity? And you can actually take kind of a contrarian perspective and say we haven't made gains, and discuss that and give some evidence why that might not be happening. So will changes in how people envision a career, change the regulatory landscape of employment? Because one of the issues with equal employment opportunity is that the laws do seem to have a bias towards career type jobs, right? They don't seem to have a bias towards contingent employees. And if you look at the laws, you kind of see that bias, that those laws seem to assume that everyone is in a career type job. But if everyone isn't in a career type job, will those laws continue to have the effect that they do? So this very much is a reflective question. I'm asking you to write about 300 to 600 words. And I think you can handle it in that amount of words. You can write a few more if you want. I'm not opposed to that. But this really is a reflection on everything we've talked about in Unit 1. So thank you in advance for your inputs. No discussion this week, just this journal. Thanks a lot.